history tour of muralism and painting on walls. And I have my notes on this iPad, so I might look a little funny. I might be lit very strangely. So let's get started. These are some of the project that we're doing with Mimi and Chelsea Prospers. This sort of outlines our guiding values and our project goals. This is left just in the presentation as we start every time. So major project goals: improve quality of life, build connections with local artists, support local businesses, and arts for positive change. And this is, we're doing a couple different projects in Chelsea, both painted murals, wheat paste murals, and a lot of fun stuff going on this summer. So since we do have quite a few people, I would just say in the chat box, feel free to write your name and maybe where you're calling in from, just so everybody can get sort of the lay of the land. But I will begin.
Thank you so much.
So I'm gonna start way back, because when I think of painting on walls, one of the first things I think of is cave paintings. And so I'm showing you a couple examples here, and they date back to about 30,000 years ago, in some cases 40,000 years. The dating is a little up in the air, just in the sense that it's very difficult to sort of date this stuff using chemicals in the rocks and stuff. So sometimes you get a variance. But one thing I do want to point out is that it doesn't matter like what continent you were on. You can see within these cave paintings very like similar images and themes. So a lot of like painting of the animals. There's this handprint that shows up a lot. And what it is people, you know, putting their hand on the rock and then taking like a little pipe and then blowing paint on it. So it's like your earliest sort of mention of spray paint. But what people started to realize with these, it was kind of cool, is they noticed that some of the fingers on the hands were like, they were cut off. And because back then, obviously your hands were your biggest and like most valuable tools, archaeologists and historians were thinking like, well, you know, people wouldn't be that careless with their hands. They wouldn't have, you know, fingers just chopped off randomly. And so what they think it is, you know, people's signatures or people trying to give a message or some type of, you know, story is going on there. And that's a lot of what painting on walls is really sort of harkening back to, is this idea of storytelling. You know, very simply put, because walls are huge, large surfaces, it's a way to communicate to a large amount of people. And it's displayed, you know, for a bunch of people to see it because it's so large. And I think that's one reason why humans have always been sort of drawn to this medium of, or canvas, I should say, of walls. So, and I want to say, like, I'm focusing here just, you know, again, greatest hits. Throughout history, you have like Buddhist monks working on walls. You have geometric murals and a lot of mosaics happening in Islam. And so it sort of like spans the gamut. While I was doing this research, I actually forgot that the Last Supper is a mural, which kind of blew my mind because, I mean, I think I always knew that it was a fresco, but I was just like, oh my goodness, the Last Supper. And so it's about 15 by 29 feet. It was painted by Da Vinci, and that was in the 1490s. And then you have Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, which was humongous and took years to paint. He actually took a year off while he was painting it. And this was not necessarily something that he wanted to do. He really sort of begrudgingly took this commission from the Catholic Church, or from the church. And it took, I mean, as I said, it took years, it damaged his eyesight. It wasn't something that he was really happy to do. But what I think is very interesting around this time, like when a lot of the patrons that are doing these murals are people who are like the Medicis, people with lots of money, or the church. And a lot of that stems from this idea that people were illiterate and the Bible was in Latin. And so people couldn't necessarily sit down and read the Bible. And so one way to sort of show people what was going on was painting it on walls, putting it in windows, stained glass windows. So a lot of the stories, obviously, on the Sistine Chapel are directly taken from those texts. And again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to, I want to make this a little bit conversational. So I'm going to jump now to the 1920s. And so here, this is specifically the Mexican muralist movement. And so this was a movement that was spurred on by the government, where they started to employ several different painters, including Jose, and I'm going to butcher these last names, I apologize, Orzico and David Squaros, I think, Squarios. And then most famously, Diego Rivera. And we'll get into him in a little bit. And these guys were all drawing from different movements going on at the same time, like Cubism, Futurism, Post-Impressionism, Impressionism. But these three artists really sort of addressed major revolutionary themes like human suffering, revolutionary heroes, and then most importantly, Mexico's working class society. I think it's interesting, this bottom piece by, I want to say his last name is Squaros. He actually did this in Los Angeles, and it was whitewashed. A lot of these, it's interesting, a lot of these murals that I'm going to show have been whitewashed for different reasons. And so this one was actually called Tropical America. It was a commission for an outdoor mural, and it was intended to show the abundance of tropical America. However, he started to create a very politicized critique of American imperialism. And so you can see in the center there, there's a crucified Native American that's in the center of the work. And then you have other pieces in there, the Mayan temple being engulfed by like tropical plants. And you have, I don't know if you can see it on this. Oh yeah, and then you can see the eagle up there, which is sort of a stand-in for American capitalist culture. So it wasn't well received, and eventually, I think after 2 months, it was whitewashed. And then I want to talk a little bit about Diego Rivera. The mural that has the blue background and a lot of people sitting around the table, that's actually at the New School, which is kind of cool. That's in one of their campus buildings in New York City. So Diego Rivera was a very famous artist, and he was most known for his frescoes. And I don't know if I mentioned before, but frescoes is basically like when you start to paint into wet plaster. It takes a long time. And that's what Da Vinci was doing. That's what Michelangelo was doing. And so you may know Diego Rivera's name because he was married and had a very sort of tumultuous relationship with Frida Kahlo, who's was a painter, also a painter. And they had a very, crazy relationship. If you haven't seen it, go see the movie Frida with Salma Hayek. It's great. And so Diego Rivera, he was again one of these Mexican muralists, and one of the most famous and sort of murals that he did, you can't see anymore because it was whitewashed, was Man at the Crossroads. And it was actually done in NYC's Rockefeller Center. And he was asked to show a man at a crossroads looking sort of with uncertainty at like this idea of new frontiers, which was sort of the whole theme of, I guess, that building. And then what a lot of people, I don't know if a lot of people know this, I think they do, but Rivera was a communist. And so obviously all of those communist ideals very much were in opposition to Rockefeller, which is like, okay, then why did they hire him? Anyways, he ended up putting in a portrait of Lenin, and they were not happy with that. And so they ended up firing him. And they before they fired him, they asked him, you know, you can either change the design and repaint it, or you can be fired. And so what he decided was, no, I'm not going to change my art. So essentially, screw you guys. And he ended up recreating the piece. This is what you see here on the bottom, these bottom two slides. And that he retitled it, what did he retitle it? Man Controller of the Universe. And so it's interesting that even though the debacle happened with Rockefeller, is that he was still able to and wanted to create this piece. So moving forward, at the same time that the Mexican muralist movement was happening, it was started to inspire the Americas. And so what was happening is we have the Great Depression. And so after the Great Depression, to sort of try and give economic relief to a lot of people, you have the Works in Progress Administration out of the New Deal. And so out of that, we got a ton of different art. And this is one huge piece. I think it's 260 feet long by Helen Lunderberg. And she's a well-known artist. She did a lot of abstractions. She lived in California. But supposedly, within the first four months of this program, over 3,500 artists were hired, and they produced over 15,000 pieces of work. So when you start to think about that and those numbers, it was pretty incredible. I read somewhere that I think the average amount that the artist would receive for their piece was like $79, which it doesn't sound like a lot now, but back then it was a decent amount. And so this mural that you're seeing in the back is the history of transportation. So the government, when they put this project into action, they said that, you know, they didn't care what you painted, but it had to be an American scene. That was sort of the only suitable topic. So perhaps they learned from the Mexican muralists and all of their communist ideals, and working that into their murals, that they decided to sort of like cut that out at the beginning by just saying it had to be an American scene. So I think that's interesting, and that's something that happens a lot, that you see throughout history, is sort of the idea of the patron. The idea of the patron sort of dictating what the design is. And putting limitations occasionally on the artist. And so this, like I said, this was a huge mural, and it was the history of transportation, so it's something that went linear across the page. And just to point out, we have, you can see Kilroy here at the bottom. Kilroy was here, you know, this was happening sort of at the same time, a little bit before. It was popularized during World War II. There's a lot of lore about where it actually comes from, whether it was, you know, somebody, you know, writing on like a tanker, like Kilroy was here to, you know, give their approval as they were checking various ships or ports or whatever. but that is sort of, Kilroy was often considered the first instance of graffiti. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. But next I want to jump into the 1960s. And so you really get this idea of community muralism, and sort of it was born and attributed to this man, Bill Walker. And he was active during the 1950s and the 1980s, and he did a lot of Black Power murals, most of which I'm not quite sure if they're still around. I know that there was a big sort of to do about trying to find a lot of his pieces. A lot of his work is titled, Wall of Respect, and that's what you see up here in the upper right corner. A lot of different portraits of community members, and he also worked with, as I said, multiple different artists. So you get that idea of a community coming together to make a piece. And so he really sort of came up on the heels of the March on Washington, the assassination of Malcolm X, and the emergence of Black Power.
Amanda, can you mention where these murals are?
Yes, the two bottom ones are in Chicago, and the two bottom ones are in Detroit, and the top one, it was in Chicago. And I'm not positive of the names of the bottom two, but the top one is Wall of Respect. So at the same time, 1960s into the 1980s, we have the modern graffiti movement. And so the modern graffiti movement, it was born out of people not having a voice. And so they were living in cities. It was mostly kids under the age of 19. And so you had people experience extreme poverty, racism, a ton of different inner city issues, and they felt like they couldn't do anything. There was a lot of promise out of the civil rights movement, equal rights. And I think once people started to see the aftermath of that, where not a lot of things were happening, you have all of these voices and people wanting to do things and wanting them to, wanting the government, wanting a variety of people to listen to them, and they can't get them to listen. And one way to, feel as though you're doing something is graffiti. You put your name out there, you put your name on something, and it gives you an identity. And so you have a variety of different artists. Supposedly Cornbread was one of the original, starting in 1965. You have Lady Pink, Fab Five Freddy, ton of different artists rise up, and it also rises up in conjunction with hip hop. And so graffiti is often considered one of the 4 fundamental pillars of hip hop, the others being DJing, MCing, and b-boying. And Caleb Nealon, he's an amazing artist. He lives in the Boston area. He and Roger Gassman wrote The History of American Graffiti. It's a fabulous book, has a lot of amazing pictures. A lot of the pictures came from Martha Cooper, who was a photographer, and still is a photographer, I should say, who was documenting a lot of what was going on. And because, this was pre-internet, pre-digital life, the only things that exist from this time period are actual photographs. And Martha Cooper took quite a bit of them. So with the rise of graffiti within all of these cities, mainly New York, Philadelphia were sort of the 2 hotspots. You also had cities then trying to combat this. So then you got the anti-graffiti campaigns, which I'm going to talk about next. And so from these anti-graffiti campaigns, you get two major women, Judy Baca out in California and Jane Golden in Philadelphia. Jane Golden, I believe, started in in Los Angeles and eventually moved out to Philadelphia. They are both artists, both started doing murals with kids, mainly actually a lot of people in gangs. And the Philadelphia Mural Arts Program was actually designed to fight graffiti. So they would give graffiti artists jobs and things like that to sort of put their talents to use in a more productive artistic outlet, is what they sort of say. And I don't necessarily know if it's more productive or not, but that's what it was for. And Judy Baca was doing sort of the similar things. You can see the piece behind her. This is the woman on the right in the pink. That was a mural that she did. It was on like a bandstand in a park, and she was working with two rival gang groups. And I mean, you can read a bunch of different stuff on her website and in books about this process, but she would have people like looking out on the street just in case rival gang members would be walking by. And this piece actually was not sanctioned by the city, but they had worked furiously to get it done. And then somebody from the city actually came and looked at it and was just like, oh no, you have to keep going. This man saw the two rival gang members, working in tandem, and was just like, oh my God, you're actually doing something good here. And so Jane Golden still works for, and Philadelphia Mural Arts is a huge institution in Philadelphia. I apprenticed with them a couple years ago, and there are just murals everywhere. It is completely intertwined into the fabric of the city. And it's absolutely fabulous to see. And they work with artists from all over the world, as well as, a cohort of artists within Philadelphia. And one of Judy Baca's most famous, if you want to look up anything else about her, is her Great Wall of Los Angeles, which is an actually huge, huge mural. So where does that leave us? And so it's like, now, okay, all that was sort of happening in the 80s, and, we still have a good amount of these sort of like anti-graffiti task force. That's what the Mayor's Mural Crew in Boston was originally founded as. But murals are starting to transform, and so now we have a ton of mural festivals. I think there's at least 3 in Massachusetts now. We have Fresh Paint in Springfield, we have Powwow Worcester, we have Beyond Walls in Lynn. And I'm not sure if Punta would necessarily consider itself a festival, but they're up in Salem. And so, murals have now taken on sort of like a huge, both huge artistically, huge movement artistically, but also a huge movement in the world of placemaking, placekeeping, and revitalization of various cities. And so I want to get into that a little bit next. Hang on, I live over a flight path and I can keep hearing the planes going back and forth, so I'm going to just shut my window. Make sure it's quiet. So, with this idea of art, a lot of time, public art specifically, a lot of times you see the Soho effect, as well as this idea of gentrification, displacement. And I would say not every time you have public art are you going to have gentrification and displacement. I would argue that if it's done properly with the community in mind, then you can avoid those pitfalls. And I think honestly, it's an incredibly difficult topic to, one, it's a difficult topic, one, in the sense that, you know, people have a wide variety of viewpoints. You have the viewpoint of the city itself, you have the viewpoint of the community members and the artists. And so it's a very hot button topic, I should say. And one example of this you can see is Wynwood Walls down in Miami. I don't know if anybody's been. Has anybody been to Wynwood Walls?
Yes, been there. Pretty
Yeah.
awesome.
What did you like it?
I did, and I mean that I lived in Miami for a while, and before that became Wynwood Walls, it was literally it was a place that no one wanted to be around, and within, you know, I think a year, it was really quick when they changed that place around, and then, you know, they had a variety of artists that would come through and built their murals, because it's always, you know, it tends to change a lot. And then that's kind of just spilled around all the other neighborhoods that is in that area. So it has changed quite a lot, that whole North Miami area.
Yeah, it has. I mean, it's crazy. I'm not too familiar with Miami, but I did visit one year, about 2 or 3 years ago. So it very much like it has been underway for a while. And it's strange because there's still blocks that are very much like warehouses. It reminds me a lot of Greenpoint up in New York, just in the sense that it's like old warehouses, like a lot of one-story auto body. I saw a lot of auto body shops, you know, kind of like grungy and dirty warehouses and things like that. I'm not quite sure of how many people actually lived in that area. But essentially what happened, for those of you that don't know, is there was essentially one property owner, where you have, and that's where you get like their Wynwood Walls banner or archway. And that's like the sort of the original area. And what he did was he started to invite artists to paint on his walls. And then it just started to grow. And then you had coffee shops come in, and it's again this idea of this Soho effect. It's like when you start to bring in the artists, you start to make it more, potentially more interesting, a nicer place to live, and so then you have like an influx, and that often displaces other individuals. I think that my like jury is out on whether Wynwood Walls was a positive or a negative. But there's definitely a lot of beautiful art going on down there. And from my understanding, it's also a very big sort of party town. So I think that also plays into that mentality of like the tourism aspect. So when talking about sort of placemaking, placekeeping, and public art, what it really gets back to is this idea of, at least from my perspective, the most successful and I think socially responsible tactics are when you start to integrate into the city. And I think Philadelphia Mural Arts has done an excellent job because it's just become part of the fabric of the city. And sorry, I'm just grabbing my notes. One thing to think about in terms of public art is this idea of making sure that you're doing your projects with the community rather than to a community. And just making sure that when you take on these projects, you're cognizant of who you're doing the project with. And I'm not sure, Carolyn and Mimi, if you want to talk a little bit more about this idea of placemaking, placekeeping, and gentrification. So I can open up to the floor.
And also any other folks on this call, if there's any on the Zoom, if you've experienced anything where you've seen kind of
Yeah, I mean,
people from
I find it's a really interesting question. When I was up in Lynn, Massachusetts, I helped co-found Beyond Walls, and we were very much started as a grassroots organization. It was, I was working in Lynn. I didn't live there, but I was working there. It really, for me, it did feel like my first home, in the sense that I had been moving around, going to grad school and college and all that stuff. And it was the first place that I had a job for more than a year. And I wasn't like moving around crazy. So for me, I sort of felt like I lived there. I think I probably spent more time in Lynn than I did in my apartment. Anyways, when we started that organization, we were very, very cognizant of what could happen and what was already happening in Lynn. I think we also entered Lynn at a tipping point. And so there had been previously for about 10 years talks of, what are we going to do with the waterfront? There were property owners thinking like, there's, housing shortages in Boston, cheap housing shortages in Boston. And so there was already a lot of movement, whether people realized it or not, happening in Lynn in terms of apartment buildings going up, various development things happening with the city, supermarkets coming in, et cetera, et cetera. And so when Beyond Walls sort of started to come up, I think a lot of people then started to see the success of that. And so now, at the same, as Beyond Walls has come, there's also been a rise in development. And so some could also point to that and say, well, that public art, that started it. And I would argue in the case of Lynn, it didn't start, the development. The development was already underway. It just sort of happened alongside or along parallel. But for us, it was really I've been out of the organization for about a year, 2 years now. And so for us, it was very important to make sure that the community was strengthened. And so what we started to do was work with, existing nonprofits, existing city departments, cultural organizations, to make sure that, people didn't feel like we were about to displace them. And, a bunch of people were going to move in because there was a ton of new, great public art. And when we started to bring in people, artists for the festival, this is something that we talked to them about. It's something that artists have to be cognizant of anyways, working in this field. And one great example was that we had Say Adams. He was the founding graphic, I think he was the founding graphic director of graphic design for Def Jam Records. So he had grown up in the graffiti movement. He was friends with Keith Haring and Basquiat and all that stuff. So he had lived through the modern graffiti movement, whatever you want to call it, and the post-graffiti movement as it entered the galleries in the 1980s. And so Say was very cognizant of what was going on in Lynn. And so he actually ended up coming back to work with school groups. So he really for us, it was important that the artists, were taking part in the community. And so we had set up a variety of different activities and talks. And he really connected with a couple of people. And so I'm not sure if he does it annually, but I've known he's done it a couple of times where he comes back and talks to middle schoolers in Lynn. And so I think, there's these wonderful relationships that can happen when you bring public artists in. So does anybody else have anything they want to mention about this topic?
Yeah, I would just mention kind of as it relates to this project in Chelsea, Mimi was very specific in bringing Amanda and I into this project as sort of a a foundation of support for Chelsea artists to be able to create work for this project. So our focus, as we are doing administration here, isn't necessarily to find the amazingest talent and bring them to Chelsea. It's more to we offer this presentation in the spirit of sharing kind of context and perspective that murals are situated in, and so that Chelsea folks can sort of have this perspective and draw inspiration from it, and we can support you all in developing your ideas. I mean, there are some folks from elsewhere that are interested in this project that want, whose interests do lie in getting to know residents in Chelsea and do visual storytelling of Chelsea. So to connect it to the city in a meaningful way that will feel like placekeeping, but that this is a topic that is very sensitive, and in this project we really want to support Chelsea artists in having the support to realize murals.
I would add one other thing. Part of what I'm trying to do with this program is, yes, for Carolyn and Amanda to kind of mentor Chelsea artists so that they can take the lead in it's not just artists from elsewhere kind of bringing their vision, but kind of growing it up from our cohort of creative people here. Some of the public art that I like the most is ones where the artist is helping the community to tell its story, that the artists are using their particular design skills and art skills to kind of draw out and reflect what's here in the community. So I'm not sure, Amanda, if you're going to show and I know it came up last time of the wheat paste murals that they did in Arlington, where the artists used photographs and storytelling of the people inside those businesses to sort of get the community to know who they are and sort of to build those connections. So it's not just about art making, but it's community building and building relationships, not just in the final outcome of the work, but in how you work. So while one of the artists that worked last summer, Alex Cook, talked about how his job being a public artist isn't just to paint the wall, but is to have conversations with the people going by and getting to know the person who's in that shop and the kid that's next door. And actually there was a little kid across the street that came and hung out with him all day while he was painting. And in the end, Alex ended up bringing the kid a box of watercolors and encouraging him to have his own expression. So it was really about sort of part of I see the role as a public artist is really those conversations and relationships and trying to figure out how to tie together. Ideally, the piece of art that goes up on a wall, it should feel like that piece could not exist anywhere else in the world except that particular location. So I'm looking forward to kind of seeing some work that is going to say something about the unique character of the wall, or this particular time in Chelsea, or that particular place. So I'm not sure that's I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Cool.
Anybody have any questions just about any stories, or I don't know, anything that we just said?
All right, then I will head to our designing processes of where to start. Oh, I think, was somebody trying to say something? I think you were muted. Yes, hang on. I'm trying to unmute you.
Okay,
Mimi,
can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I have a question. How do you define Chelsea artist?
Mimi?
I would say somebody who has any kind of connection to Chelsea. So you live in Chelsea, you work in Chelsea, you're from Chelsea, you've gotten to know people in Chelsea. It's really just somebody who's gotten to know the community. Ideally, it's somebody who lives here and is kind of entwined in the community, and that is somebody who can help, that's kind of not just speaking in dialogue with the community, but in some ways is speaking from their own particular experience of the neighborhood.
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay. So designing processes, where to start? So one thing, actually, I'm going to start here, actually. So what I like to think of, and so I've helped a lot of different artists put up murals, and I put up murals as well. And these are some of the major things to consider when designing. So before you, you can have a concept and start to work it out, but when you start to do your mock-up, this is one thing that you'll want. These are 5 things that you'll want to take into consideration. Vantage point. So who's going to see the mural? Will it be seen by people walking, driving, biking? Does the wall go with traffic? So is the driver going to see it when they drive by, or is it going to be in their rear view mirror? Are there sidewalks? So that's just something to keep into consideration. Your materials are also something you want to think about. Are you going to be using spray paint? Are you going to be using bucket paint? Bucket, I call liquid paint bucket paint. Is it going to be a fresco? What materials are you going to use? And you got to also think about the wall surface. Your wall might, in some cases, dictate the materials. In the sense of like, you got to make sure that you get the masonry primer if you're working on stone. If you're working on wood, you're going to want to think about it potentially different. If there's water coming out of your wall, you're going to potentially want to, hit it with dry lock, or not paint on it, or use other, mineral paint, which doesn't crack or bubble. So a lot of different materials out there to get you your desired product. You also want to think about the texture of the wall. If it's brick, maybe you don't want to do a really intricate design because painting in grout is a pain in the butt. Stucco is like really flat. Some artists love painting on textured walls. I've had artists where, they're painting on a wall and they can put like half their arm in it because, it's like a party wall and there's another wall behind it. And so it's like you have brick and then stucco. So some people love textured walls. It depends. I've also worked on in terms of like materials. Sometimes you can work on canvas and then, put it up later. So that's another material you could potentially consider. Other things you'll want to think about are any wall impediments. So are there windows? Are there pipes, air vents, plants, birds' nests? What's going on in front of the wall and on the wall? You might want to think about how you can use these things to enhance your design, or if you can hide them. I've seen a lot of artists have like a huge air shaft on their wall, and they were able to just completely blend it in. There's a great example of that up in Lynn. Don Rymix, there was a huge air vent. I want to say it was at least a foot, maybe 1.5 feet wide, and he just made it disappear. Safety is also another huge thing. Is there anything above or below that could cause a safety risk? And then it's like, how are you going to reach your wall? Are you going to be working on a ladder? Are you going to be working on an aerial lift, scaffolding? And so there's a lot of things to consider. If you're working with an aerial lift, you want to make sure that you're not parking it on top of a not pothole. I'm blanking on the word, a sewer grate. Thank you. You don't want to put, your main, your weight on that sewer grate. That could potentially cause a problem. Electrical wires can also pose a huge issue if you're working on a lift. You don't want to go within 10 feet of those. And if you were going to go within 10 feet, you want to potentially talk to somebody about wrapping them. So there's a lot of different things that you want to think about when you're designing your mural. So that's more like logistical items. In terms of your concept, what I like to start with is this 5 W's and 1 H, which is the who, what, where, when, why, and how of something. I'll give an example. So I had, and this isn't necessarily related to a mural, but a lot of artists use these 5 W's and the 1 H when they're thinking about their work. So I am taking a class with an artist named Axel Void. He's a muralist down in Miami. And he actually created an exhibition for his grandmother. And so I think I told somebody about this recently, but his where, for example, was he actually, when he was installing this exhibit for his grandmother, he actually hung it lower because she was in a wheelchair. So instead of hanging it the normal sort of like eye height of a person standing up, he hung it lower. And so that's an example of like a where. You know, an example of a who would be like, who are you making this artwork for? In the case of this project, you know, you're making this a little bit for yourself, but also for the public of Chelsea. So you've got to potentially think about, you know, your viewers and how you want to connect to them. The how is sort of like what we talked about earlier in terms of like bucket paint, spray paint. And then it comes sort of down to the also like this idea of the why. And when artists start thinking about the why, sometimes, you know, you actually realize that, you know, maybe a, you know, sculpture over there isn't gonna, you know, do what it needs to do. You know, in fact, actually, you know, it needs to be, you know, seats, like artistically designed seats, because that's a better use of the space, and that's not necessarily what the who need. So that's another thing to think about. The where is obviously the wall, or whatever surface you're working on. So those are a couple of things to like help get your ideas percolating. The 5 things that I like to do when I'm designing is research. So that helps me sort of like ground myself in exactly, you know, what's the place that I'm working in. I also love to look at other people's work and get inspired that way. You know, a lot of people get inspired by like going for a walk or going for a hike. And these seem like very sort of like common sense things, but I think a lot of people, when they get in front of their sketchbook or in front of their computer, they're like, oh my God, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to make. I don't know what to draw. And so I think sometimes if you can go back to those sort of very simple processes, then it sort of helps you can get out of that rut. So I really do suggest looking at other people's work and sketch, like sketch out those ideas, put something on paper. I think that's super important. It helps you just work things out. And a lot of times, you know, artists are usually visual people. And so I like to tell people, you know, it's helpful to see that out on the paper, and it's can also be a good physical exercise. And then lastly, I you know, get feedback. I often send my designs to my muralist friends. I'm like, okay, what do I need to do here? And they'll say like, oh, well, it's kind of busy there. You know, you might want to think about getting rid of this element, or, you know, this color is really awful. Why are you using that? And I should say, you know, a lot of artists also do commission-based work. And so this changes a little bit when you have to take into consideration commission-based stuff, but we won't really get into that. So lastly, you know, the one thing that I've been sort of trying to get across throughout this entire presentation is the idea that murals are stories. You know, it might be a scene from a story. It might not have like the full beginning, middle, and end there on the wall. But there's usually a message. There's usually a story going on. And so I really want to sort of get across, you know, what is your message? What's your story? And that, I think since we are.
Can you actually go back? I do want to add a little bit to the 5 steps and offer something that, you know, after the get feedback piece, thinking about like who your village is, like who your team is. I mean, some of us have all the skills. We can just like rock out and like make the thing. But some of us have, you know, limitations in one way or another, and need to, understand that the best possible way to achieve like the vision is to work with other people. So I would say, you know, with the get feedback piece, you know, talk to people who might be interested in this kind of thing, and might be open to collaboration. Seeing, you know, you might talk to somebody who's like, oh, you know, talk to this other person. And yeah, and so some folks we might offer like, oh, okay, you might want to talk to this person to like collaborate with. If you're thinking about, you know, about collaboration, then, you know, it's worth talking with people. I think that a lot of times people think that you could just, you know, there's a muralist and it's like a singular person who like does their thing, but really in real life, you know, people work in teams.
Yep. Those walls get big really fast, and you know, when you're one small person, it can be quite a physical load to lift. And so I actually I'm working on a piece right now in Somerville for Cambridge Health Alliance, and I had my good friend Sophie come out because I needed some assistance. And it was just, I mean, I know we're talking more about design processes, but I mean, it really does take a team. And she was able to, you know, help me work through some of my anxiety about one of the things that I was doing. And she's like, no, that's fine. You know, look, yeah, that looks fine. And that's totally in proportion. And so it's always helpful to talk to other artists and get feedback and all that stuff.
And the storytelling piece is also, I think, a team. You know, you want to make sure that the story resonates with the place. So, you know, just kind of running it by a few folks. Like that's kind of part of what me and Amanda are doing, is to like, you know, tell us your story you're thinking about telling, and we can sort of like, you know, be a sounding board and offer like, oh, check this out, check that out. That might help give you another piece of the story or something like that. So just this kind of like this emphasis on like, you know, the idea of the singular artist isn't really it. I don't know if other people have received that idea as like a real thing, but it's not really. This is really a team kind of approach of thinking about like who's on your team.
One thing that I've never tried to take on a mural. So I guess one quick big question is, what are some of like the common mistakes a new muralist might make so that folks can avoid that? And like, I know when I used to be in video production, and they, when we were just learning how they only let us make a 3-minute video, because otherwise, you know, everybody had like, I'm going to make the greatest movie ever, and would get really overwhelmed. And I imagine for doing a mural, it's like, you can have this like, I'm going to make a giant mural and just that, because it's just physically demanding to execute something like that. So do you have any recommendations on how to kind of translate these big dreams into something more manageable?
Yeah, I think making sure, well, yes, being aware of like, I think starting with a small piece is always good if you're a newbie. You know, something of a more understandable size, or even just starting to work, like if you're very interested in doing large pieces, you want to maybe potentially start doing smaller pieces, well, you know, like 4x4 feet pieces or 6x6 pieces, 6 foot by 6 foot pieces in your, you know, smaller space, to understand how you work on that scale. I think that can be helpful. In terms of speeding up the process, when you get on the wall, there's a lot of different things that you can do. I would always say that you want to have a sketch. I would say, you know, unless you are going out to like a free wall or something like that and just like throwing something up really quick as like an experiment, I would suggest having some sort of idea or mock-up or sketch when you get there. Just so you're not like, oh my God, I have this crazy wall and, you know, some paint, what am I gonna do? So obviously having an idea of what you want it to look like is gonna help you. But, you know, there's projection to get your drawing up on the wall. That's an easy way to get your sketch up and do it kind of fast. One mistake that I have learned is when you do projection, you're drawing it out on the wall with graphite. And those pencil marks can get very, very confusing. And so I've often seen artists actually paint and project at the same time. So they're putting down blocks of color while they're projecting. Usually this is at night because projectors obviously don't work in the daytime. So the graphite lines can get very confusing. You know, some people use grids to block out some of their work. There's also like this other, it's like a grid, but a lot of people use symbols. I can go into that later. We're gonna do a talk about like putting up logistics and things like that, both with wheat paste, and so different processes we'll talk about later. But yeah, I think there's definitely little things like that you can do to make it faster. But definitely having an idea of what you want to do when you get to the wall is a good idea. And in terms of like judging size, I think a lot, it's like getting an idea of, you know, a lot of times people will use like assistants to help block out color in the beginning, and that can also be very helpful. So I do that a lot. I've worked with a lot of artists that do that as well. And so, you know, you work with somebody to put those blocks of color up, and then the sort of main or lead artist goes in and fills out and does all the detail. So that's another way to sort of speed up the process. Did I hit your question? Was there another?
I guess a little bit, even just in terms of conceiving it. Like, are there some like common mistakes that you've seen that you kind of new people might make that they should avoid?
You potentially doing, detail. Usually it's that translation of detail. And so like when you get up onto the wall, it's that, you know, you're used to seeing something very small, and then all of a sudden it's this huge thing. And so it's that translation of size, I think, that often confuses people. I would say you want to definitely think about scale when you're designing. And so what pieces of the design are going to be small, what piece of the design is going to be large, or what piece of the design is going to be intricate. And I think a lot, you know, depending on how you design, sometimes I would suggest staying away from that sort of intricate side. It can get a little bit messy, but also potentially time consuming. And you have to understand, like with murals, it may look very different up close than it does far away. And so when you're stepping back, you have a lot of what artists like to call like optical mixing. So things sort of start to come together. So it might not look like a fold of a shirt close up, but when you step back 40 feet, it's like, okay, now I can see that shadow. That makes a lot of sense. So it's a lot of it is a trial and error process. I think, you know, in the case of this project, you guys are very lucky because you have Carolyn and I to help you out. And then if we don't know the question, we have a lot of friends that will probably know the answer. So relying, working with, if you work with us, we can definitely help you, tailor your design to make sure that it's, hitting your level of expertise, and also making sure that it's going to be a quality piece as well. In terms of the presentation, I did want to mention one thing. Just, I know that MFA is not open right now, but I was talking a little bit about the post-graffiti movement, which is essentially a lot of the graffiti art moved into like the gallery spaces in the 1980s. And that's where you got Basquiat, Keith Haring, and all of those guys. So up at the MFA right now is Writing the Future, Basquiat and the hip hop generation. And I believe there's a lot of good stuff online. I haven't looked and dived into it that much, but it is there as a resource. So I just wanted to mention that, as well as all of these amazing centers of public art all around Massachusetts. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Ed Medros from the Walnut Street Synagogue. So I think this was a great presentation, because I don't know how many times I've driven in Lynn, in Chelsea, and you see power boxes at corners with all sorts of art on it. And so you ride by fast, and if you can take a stop, you look at it. And sometimes it's confusing to understand what the artist is depicting or his message. So is there places on, like the Lynn website, City of Lynn website, or the Chelsea website, where there'll be a document talking about the art and saying, this was done by artist XYZ, and this is what he is depicting? Okay, so that's the first question. Two, when you started out in Lynn, you had Lynn is similar to Chelsea in a lot of ethnic backgrounds there. So in certain areas where the ethnicity was very high, did people paint their pictures there, telling the story of their ethnicity? Or, so like in a Spanish section, did they teach paint a Polish picture, versus in this section they did that? How did they determine where and when to paint?
Right. So let me answer your first question. I'm not sure I think Lynn does have, I'm not involved with Beyond Walls any longer.
Yep.
But I do believe that they have quite a bit of information on their website. When I was with them, we tried to, make sure all the bios for the artists were up. What we're doing here in Chelsea, I know for the chalk art, we have already put up bios for a lot of the artists, which I want to say gives a little bit sort of about like their artist statement, tells us a little bit about their work. I am planning and hoping that we will be putting other stuff up on the website as the calls get completed and we choose our artists.
Sure.
I think you're correct. It's really important to do that and give all of the hardworking artists the props that they deserve. So I'm glad that you've mentioned that. Specifically with Lynn, what we tried to do the first year and the second year that I was there was we specifically looked, so the way that the whole project started was a bunch of different surveys had happened in Lynn about what downtown residents wanted to see. And one of those things was safer streets, lighting, public art, businesses open later, and a variety of other different things. And so we took those, I think the first 3 or 4, and tailored our projects all around those. So with public art, we decided, okay, we're gonna have a mural festival. With lighting, we ended up lighting up Lynn streets with vintage neon. We did underpass lighting as well, under the MBTA underpasses. With the artists, we decided to, the first year and the second year, we wanted to make sure that local people were represented, local graffiti artists, as well as just local artists. So we worked with some kids at Raw Artworks. We made sure that there was a couple of Lynn artists present. And we made sure that there were graffiti artists as well. And then we started to make sure that we had artists whose work either reflected the cultures and different ethnicities and subject matter. We made sure that their subject matter, their background, ethnicity, and culture were related to the peoples of Lynn. So for example, we had a couple artists from Puerto Rico, we had a couple artists from the Dominican Republic, we had some Cambodian artists. So making sure that people, and a lot of the work that these artists created had cultural ties to a variety of different things. So I know Don Rymix, he painted some indigenous peoples of Puerto Rico. I'm blanking on the name. There was a woman who, sorry?
Taino.
Yes, thank you, Taino. There was a woman that she was from Miami, so she decided, and she understood, like, you know, where Massachusetts was situated and some of the Native Americans, so she depicted a Native American. So there was a lot of different things that people sort of brought just because it's a subject matter within their own work.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, but it wasn't like specific to a neighborhood. It was just, we just curated it as, you know, what would potentially look good next to
And
what.
did you, one last question.
Yeah.
Did you have, was there a lot of, once the artist drew their pictures, was there a lot of, afterwards, was there a lot or any defacing of the art?
No, I think there was one instance, one very small, somebody like took a paint marker and wrote something, but that was it.
All right. Very good.
Usually all of that stuff is left alone. I have found over the years that people don't really tag other people's artwork. It's sort of just like, oh wow, you know, like you've put up this amazing piece, like I'm not gonna, you know, disturb it. And a lot of these artists are very well, the ones that we used in Lynn were, a lot of them were well known. So it was sort of like, if you touch that, that's not very nice.
Yeah.
And sort of thing.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I drive through Division Street often,